Good morning, everyone. It's Mary Rowe, and it's good afternoon and good evening to those that are joining us and not here in New York or in other parts of North America on a different time zone or in Europe or in Asia. We are delighted to welcome you to the MAS Global webinar series. This one is on evaluating the resilience of cities, the role of measurements and indicators, and we're very pleased to have our colleagues joining us, Eugine, Monica, Garima, and Eduardo, to enlighten us a bit on their approaches to this and how they see the importance of measurement and indicators. We had a live session here at the MAS offices a couple of months ago that was very popular and obviously could only be attended by people that happened to be in New York at that time. So we are pleased to be able to make this available to folks who can listen in and participate from their desks and other places where they're able to get access to this. We're also recording this session, and we'll put it up on the MAS Global website so people can watch it again and again and again because we know the content's going to be so good. MAS has been running a global practitioner network for a couple of years, and we're keen to continue to add to our ranks. And so if you're aware of people who are doing on-the-ground interesting stuff around building the urban resilience in their communities, and our practitioners actually engaged in particular work and researching what works and what lessons they're learning, we'd be delighted to have them as members of the network. And joining us on this call and our staff, Lawrence and Joanna, are both dedicating themselves to building this network and populating our website and our digital platforms with people that have interesting stories to tell and interesting lessons to share. We're also with various partners through the MAS Global Network participating in other webinars, and you'll hear later about one that's happening next week with our great partners, Cities of Migration, on the relationship between resilience and settlement, newcomer settlement. So pleased to have their partnership and others who are on the call as well. So in terms of housekeeping, everybody, just so you know how the way these calls work, we always have a few bumps here and there when the technology doesn't always live up to its expectations, but let's hope this is flawless. And everyone is muted, as you can see, so we won't hear you as you're running around doing other things as you sit at your desk. But you can, as you see on the, when you're looking at the screen, you'll see there is a place for you to actually type a question in. So please, by all means, feel free to do that, and Joanna will field those and make sure they get to the presenters. If you're on a computer and relying on the computer for the audio, you may find that that's not as consistent a feed as if you were to choose to call in by telephone. So I think many of you have already done this, and you can go to your control panel and see that if you select telephone, it will give you a dial-in number there and a code, and sometimes we find that that's a better way for more reliable audio, and you won't have the same frustrations with delays and things like that. So I'm going to introduce Jeannie Birch, who is well known to us here at MAS because she chairs our board. But she has a day job where she's the co-director of urban research at the University of Pennsylvania, and she also chairs this very important World Urban Campaign for UN Habitat. So she has a very action-packed 18 months ahead of her as she ramps up the global community to focus on what the pressing urban issues are that should be at the top of the agenda for UN Habitat next year in Quito. So we're very pleased to have Jeannie in our wheelhouse here at MAS. She's been terrific, providing terrific leadership to us here and to particularly the global program, and we're delighted to have her here because she actually knows a lot about measurement and indicators. So Jeannie, over to you to moderate this panel. We're going to hear from each of the presenters, then some discussion amongst them and Jeannie, and then we'll take questions from the audience, and we'll be out in 60 minutes. So Jeannie, I'm going to pass it to you. Thanks for joining us today, everybody.
Hi, everyone. This is Joanna. Jeannie, are you there? We can't hear you, I'm afraid. It looks like your audio should be live.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Evaluating the Resilience of Cities. This is Jeannie Birch here in New York. As you know, resilience has many definitions, and it is very much in the center of global conversations today. At the United Nations, for example, the Third World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction will be held in Sendai. The upcoming post-2015 Framework for Development, otherwise that will produce the Sustainable Development Goals, is considering it. The Council of Partners and COP21 in Paris, Habitat 3 in 2016 are all focusing on the question of resilience in one way or another. International organizations like the OECD and APEC and others are organizing conferences, research and policy recommendations, and agreements on the topic. National governments are faced with natural and human-made disasters that are having enormous of developing resilience frameworks. Regional and municipal governments, where the rubber hits the road, are detailing their approaches. Academic researchers have produced reams of material on this subject. NGOs and foundations like MAS, Global, ICLEI, Rockefeller Foundation, UN Habitat are putting their plans in place. Now let's turn now to cities and resilience, the particular topic of today's discussion. I turn you to the definition that the Rockefeller Foundation is using, or the discussion that they are prompting in their 100 Cities, Resilient Cities Initiative, which started about 2 years ago. They note that cities are complex, that their resilience can be understood in terms of numerous factors that influence their ability to continue to function in the face of challenging circumstances, to recover quickly from disruptions, and the relationships between these factors. Their aim is to make better cities better, particularly in addressing long-term and short-term problems, whether they're chronic stresses or acute shocks. They organize thinking around resilience into 4 areas: health and well-being, economy and society, leadership and strategy, infrastructure and environment. Our speakers today are going to be addressing many of these topics. I'd also like to remind us of the importance of monitoring in public and private decision-making around key topics such as resilience. We all know that you can't manage what you don't measure, and we all know of particular importance are the indicators that are chosen to monitor. The choice underlines what is important to the enterprise. Now, there are various types of indicators and various ways to report them and various ways to think about them. We can think about them in terms of performance versus results. We can think about them in terms of whether they fall into the categories of pressure, state, and response. We do know, however we think about them, that to be useful, indicators need to be what we call, by the acronym, SMART. They need to be specific, measurable, accessible, and replicable and timely. Now, there are various reporting mechanisms for indicators. They may be indices, which are agglomerations of indicators that could be weighted or unweighted. It can be reporting according to core sets or headline indicators, or one might use a dashboard or a catalog approach. Again, our speakers will talk about that today. But we know to be effective, we need to have, with indicators and measurements such as this, leadership buy-in. They need to be undertaken frequently. They need to be relatively simple, and above all, they need to be acted upon. Now today, we have a really exciting panel. This is truly a global conversation. From Paris, we have Monica Brezzi, who's head of Regional Analysis and Statistics Unit at OECD in the Directorate for Public Governance and Territorial Development. From Nairobi, we have Eduardo Moreno, who is Director of Research and Capacity Development at UN Habitat. And from Bangalore, we have Garima Jain, Senior Associate at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. Let's have Monica lead off the conversation about her work. Monica?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good afternoon from Paris.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for this invitation. I will discuss briefly recent work carried out by the OECD, which touches upon many of the points already mentioned by Jeannie. Next slide, please. We know that the progress of our societies goes well beyond GDP per capita or the economic growth, and to drive our decisions and design policies, we need to look at the full dashboard of indicators that matter for well-being. That's why the OECD since 2011 has research on measuring economic well-being, but also quality of life across the OECD countries with the OECD Better Life Initiative. And more recently, in 2014, we have taken that work down to the regions, so to the subnational levels, to the regions and cities, because most factors that really affect people's daily lives are actually determined at the local level. And when we observe what happens, not only in countries but within our countries, we do observe that there are large disparities on economic performance for sure, but also in quality of life in terms of access to education, access to services, but in terms also of outcomes of quality of life. I always give a small example regarding the life expectancy across OECD countries. As you may know, now the gap between the 34 OECD countries is of about 9 years. If you consider just the United States, the gap in life expectancy among the American states is 6 years. So almost 2/3 of the gap that we observe across all the OECD countries is just found within one country. So that's the reason why, and this is the work we have done recently called How is Life in Your Region? You see the report where we give a common analytical framework to measure the well-being in regions and cities together with a set of databases so that you compare these values, measure and compare these values across 362 OECD regions. But we also looked into some case studies of regions that have been using indicators and metrics of well-being to improve their decisions, so that to be able to provide some guidelines to all levels of government on how to use indicators of well-being for their policy making. Just to give you another number, almost 70% of the total public investment in OECD countries is actually carried out by subnational governments. So they do have a very important role in improving our lives and making cities and regions resilient and sustainable over time. Next slide, please. So this is just in the framework that we have used to identify the relevant dimensions and indicators. The framework starts with a consideration that when we consider urban resilience, as Jeannie said, we can have many definitions around the globe, but essentially is about to strengthen the social, economic, environmental fabric of a city or a region. So we do need a multidimensional metrics that looks both at individual characteristics, but also the characteristics of the place, of the region where you live, of the city where you live. We know at this point that place characteristics can affect today's well-being and can affect the future prosperity beyond our individual capacity or our individual characteristics. So the most important aspect in our framework is actually that when you bring down from the national to the regional or city level, you actually look at the interaction between the individual and the place-based characteristics. And when we talk about places, cities or regions, we talk about complex systems that include, of course, not only the characteristics of the places, but also the institutions that run the places, the governance and the citizenship that have an impact on the well-being of citizens. Next slide, please. So I just instead of going through the framework that we have used, I will use my time to share with you 5 lessons that we have learned with this work on the role of indicators. And these 5 lessons have also shaped the framework and the way we measure well-being of regions and cities. So the first one is to focus on expected results. We often measure what we can easily count, for example, the number of hospital beds, but this doesn't tell you much about whether people are healthy. So we have made an effort to actually compile outcome indicators expressed in terms of people's well-being. As Jeannie said, the choice of indicators underline what is important, and we thought it's important, of course, the resource you put, the input you put in a system are extremely important, but we thought that it's also very important to raise awareness, to focus on what are the expected results. So to talk about life expectancy, to talk about age-adjusted mortality rate rather than hospital beds or number of doctors. Next slide, please. Secondly, we can move to the next slide. Secondly, the other aspect is to recognize that these different dimensions, we have identified, as you saw before from the flower, 9 dimensions of well-being that include material conditions such as income, jobs, and housing, and quality of life conditions such as education, environmental security, civic engagement, and so on. But these dimensions shouldn't taken separately. Focusing on outcomes, in fact, helps draw out the synergies among the different aspects of well-being. So here you see that to try to build also measures and indicators that we define cross-dimensional indicators, meaning to understand better how the different dimensions affect each other. And this is, of course, to make it operational, a way also to build policies that are integrated policies that try to pursue economic growth together with environmental objectives, for example, or to pursue economic growth while looking at the social inclusion. That's fine. We can move to the third. The third point is, as measure today is very important. You see here an example of a French region. This is our website where you can find similar measures, these multidimensional measures for all the OECD regions, and you have a snapshot of the well-being of a region today. But it is very important to monitor changes over time. We try to do that with a first simple mechanism to look at the relative change in each of these dimensions, health, safety, and so on, with these arrows, whether the regions has improved or not over time in the past 13 years. So this is definitely the most important aspect, to look not only at the well-being of today, but the sustainability of well-being, or the conditions to make cities and regions resilient. The next slide, please. On the sustainability of well-being and the resilience of regions, I think an important lesson is also to consider the time dimension. So to turn around a place and improve people's well-being can take time, and actually the different well-being dimensions can take different times to change. And this is important to recognize that public policies have short-term and long-term effects. In these graphs, you see, for example, that in the case of education, only 8% of the regions that were in 2000 in the bottom part of the distribution were not in the bottom part in 2013. While the air quality of our regions has improved much faster. Final lesson, next slide please, is that inequalities on the resilience and sustainability of well-being, inequalities also have an impact. So here you see in this graph a clear relationship between the level of inequality within regions, given by the Gini index on the x-axis, and the economic growth on the other axis. So we do have a negative relationship between inequality and economic growth, meaning that a more inclusive society may also be an element to resilience, an element of resilience to future economic shocks. So these are the 5 lessons that have also shaped the way we have decided to measure well-being in regions. As I said, so far we are able to have comparative values for a certain number of indicators, so for all the OECD regions. And the next step would be, we can move to the next slide, the next step would be to adapt this metric also to metropolitan areas, to see whether, and cities, so to see whether the metrics I have briefly described can be adapted also to cities more specifically. So here, just to give you an example, here you see the percentage of population living in cities, in urban areas in OECD countries that breathe an air which is below the standard recommended by the WHO. So the good news is that between 2002 and 2011, the population having, let's say, decent quality of air has doubled from 15% to 32%. The bad news is that still in 2011, more than 500 million people live in cities with air quality above the recommended standards. So this shows already that there is, on one side, there is an urban problem that can be addressed. There is already a sort of international standards where cities can benchmark themselves, and there is now the possibility to measure this kind of indicators also at a very fine, detailed level. So this is just one example of how we can move forward and maybe to adapt this metric to monitor also sustainable development goals on making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. You can move to the next slide. I just want to thank you and leave the links to the publication as well as to the database where you can find all the results and play around with your region or the region you are interested in looking. Thank you.
Okay, so next up we have Eduardo.
Thank you. This is Eduardo Moreno. Good afternoon, Jeannie. Good afternoon to the people listening to us from Nairobi, Kenya. Today I'm going to talk about the City Prosperity Initiative, making a strong connection to the theme that we are discussing, which is how to evaluate resilience in cities and how measurement and indicators can contribute to this. Please, next. Next one, please. Let me provide you with some initial trends that are global trends that the Global Urban Observatory of UN Habitat and our flashy report, The State of the World Cities, has analyzed in the last years, which all of them have very serious implications to the theme of resilience. The first one is that analysis in a global sample of cities made by different partners, the study of Soli Angel in New York, Columbia University, UN Habitat, etc., show that cities in the world, being from the global north or from the south, they have grown on average 3 times more of what they needed in terms of demographic population or demographic growth. 3 times more, basically because of, I would say, real estate interest or other important interests that are not always necessary well-planned cities, even in the developed part of the world. What is the meaning of this growth? It's not only that cities are expanding unnecessarily to endless peripheries, but they are consuming, obviously, much more energy. They are in require of much more public transport and other associated public amenities and infrastructure. In addition to this, and I would say perhaps because of this, also cities have been growing more and more unequal. OECD has done a fantastic work on depicting inequalities in the world, at least in the OECD cities. We have done similar studies at city level. Recently, we published a book with CAF, a development bank in Latin America, for the first time analyzing income consumption inequalities at city level in cities, and we found on a global average that today cities are 70%, 75% cities of the world, again from all parts of the world, are today more unequal of they used to be 20 years ago. In other words, 75% of the world population, urban, is living in more unequal places. Third important thing, because of this growth of cities, cities are dramatically reducing the densities in their places. This is affecting economies of scale, economies of agglomeration, the possibility of having economic returns, infrastructure returns, etc. And all these elements together, in addition with others, but fundamentally these elements, have been producing important shocks and human-made, and even somehow, in some cases, natural disasters that are affecting these cities. From 1997 to now, all these natural disasters and human-made disasters multiply by 4, according to UN Habitat, in most of the cities of the world. And 80 to 85% of these disasters were most of the time affecting the poor and the vulnerable populations. Can we move to the next one, please? Because of this, UN Habitat produced in 2012, as part of the State of the World Cities report and the studies on global trends of urbanization, a new report in which we advocated for the need of a new fresh notion of prosperity or sustainable development, one that is transformative in nature, that need, as Monica said in these 5 points that I fully subscribe, in one of these, that need to have interactions among the different dimensions of development, that need to center in people, that need to be inclusive in nature and sustainable, in order to try to understand that cities of the 21st century need to be different. How different? Next, please. These cities of the 21st century need to have a certain of common features, whether they are in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, or in Latin America, in order to try to reduce these vulnerability factors and in order to try to minimize the impact of shocks and natural and man-made disasters. They need to be more compact. They need to mix land uses. They need to have greater heterogeneity and functionality in their spaces. And of course, they need to provide public goods and to have a different scale. When cities tend to have these elements, they would have some associated benefits on this. For instance, they will enable the possibility of stimulating local jobs. They would reduce disasters. They will reduce the vulnerabilities of this poor population. They will be much more resilient, and they will tend to create more harmony of the different components of what prosperity entails. Can we move to next to talk about prosperity and resilience? UN Habitat, in something, by the way, quite similar to what OECD has done, but instead of a flower, we thought in something in which human beings can have the possibility to act. And we thought metaphorically on a wheel of prosperity, a wheel that is made of different spokes, if we continue with this metaphor, and each one of these spokes are the dimensions of what a sustainable and prosperous city should look like. I don't need to tell you which are these dimensions because you can see them on your screen, but we are talking about cities that need to generate jobs, to have adequate basic and modern infrastructure, to have good quality of life, but not as a byproduct of other policies, with the specific policies of quality of life. Cities that need to share prosperity for all, that need to have environmental conditions and sustainable conditions for the environment, and obviously that need to be well governed. These cities will have much more possibilities to bring prosperity to all their inhabitants, but also to reduce the chances of all these disasters. How this works? If we move to the next one, this hexagon translates into a kind of a spider diagram. In this case, it was a pentagon because we were evolving in the thinking. Governance was not yet here. And you can see as an example measurements in which 0, if my cell will be the hell of prosperity, and 1 will be the heaven. And then you will see cities like Vienna that are very harmonic in their development in all the dimensions of prosperity, but as cities from middle income and poor income countries are measured, you will see two interesting characteristics. A distortion in the different dimensions of prosperity, the case of my own country, Mexico, where equity, somehow productivity, are highly penalizing in these indicators, and Johannesburg even more being in our databases the most unequal city today in the world. With this kind of information, you will be able, when you talk about the city diagnosis, speaking to mayors, decision makers, stakeholders, where the city is having some specific problems. You can identify them, and you can try to imagine what kind of solutions you should implement. Understanding that all these measurements, and again, we are very close to what OECD Monica said, are always measurement of outcomes, and always looking at the interactions, and are always try to be measured over time. So these 5 conditions, which are very interesting, fully apply to the City Prosperity Index. If we look to the next one, please. When we measure this, since we are talking about resilience, in all what we have, resilience was not there. And then some governments, the Ethiopian government, the Vietnamese government, and the cities of these countries told us, you need to integrate resilience in the City Prosperity Index. And we are working on this, and this is not final work. So for me, this web seminar is very timely to socialize with you the advances in terms of operationalizing the resilient component of this City Prosperity Index with 3 or 2 basic conditions. The first one, in any of them, resilience, like governance, if you come back please to the next one, to the previous one, resilience in all the cases, in many of the existing monitoring tools, remain at the process level of the indicators. We are trying to do an exercise to move to the outcome in order to integrate it like the other dimensions of prosperity. And we propose, based very close to what the Rockefeller Resilient 100 Cities have, different timings in the resilience component. One indicator should try to capture as a proxy the vulnerability notion of cities. It could be a reduction in the number or in the proportion of affected, could be fatalities, could be populations. We will perhaps insist on the poor by natural disasters in 2 different time periods. Second, and this is really a proxy, how to recover. And for that we took, during the event of the disaster, And later on, for instance, which is the capacity of the city to immediately and during the disaster to recover in terms of providing access to potable water. In some places, people told us mobile or ICT during disasters. And finally, how we include a much more complex dimension of preparedness. And for that, our suggestion is that we don't need an indicator, but we use the City Prosperity Index as part of the resilient component, and we change the metric in this way. We move to the next one, and the last one, by the way. We could have a checklist of inputs and process-oriented indicators, institutions, rule, the policies, the actions, to give some values to them, and then we move the resilience notion to the center of the wheel of prosperity. And what we will measure is how a city that is not resilient versus a city that is resilient, how it affects or benefit the prosperity of the city. In other words, the resilient notion becomes the vector of prosperity in the city in this measurement tool. To give an example, take a city that is affected by floods. How in a certain number of years, the productivity, the equity, the environmental sustainability, and the other dimensions of prosperity are improving if the resilient notion is also improving. We are doing some level of correlation of these indicators and association of these causalities, and we could detect to which extent resilience is a factor of prosperity or is a constraint of prosperity, and vice versa. Like this, and I would like to conclude with this to have my time, is that the notion of resilience doesn't need to have a set of complicated number of indicators and to consider that is work outside the realm of the city and all the indicators of the city, but is part of this notion of interaction among dimensions, and the resilience is one of these components. And we will measure how it interacts with the others. That will be our proposal for the resilient notion as part of prosperity. Thank you very much.
Unmuted. Thank you, Eduardo, and thank you, Monica. I think both of you have put forward some very interesting frameworks for thinking about resilience in terms of desirable outcomes, in terms of ideal city form. Let us now turn to Garima.
Garima, are you there?
Can you hear me? Hello?
We can hear you now. Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, great. Great. Thanks, Jeannie, and thanks, Monica and Eduardo, for some excellent presentations here. Good day to the rest of the group listening from all over the world. Here it's almost about night, so I will try and keep it succinct and simple. As we have already established the multidimensional nature of resilience and the fact that well-being and prosperity are at the heart of it, I'd like to bring your attention to the idea of risk and location with this presentation and urge you to think of ways in which a measuring tool can also be a tool for management. I mean, since it's understood that there are multiple dimensions, also means that there are multiple stakeholders involved both in the process of data collection as well as carrying out resilience building exercises. So I'll take your attention to the next slide, where I talk about the definition of risk. So risk itself is a combination of hazard, vulnerability, exposure, and capacities. Hazard is often it's derived out of external factors which could be climatic, tectonic, or man-made, whereas vulnerability and capacities are more inherent characteristics of the elements which are at risk, and these characteristics could be social, economic, environmental, and institutional in nature. These also provide the same resources in a way for the elements to cope up with these risks. In a way, to build capacities also means building resilience. At the same time, exposure, which is a central element of this definition of risk as well, is primarily dependent on the location and concentration of these elements. So where they are located will address and deliver the kind of risk they are exposed to. So this, in a way, gives us a sense of that risk is located in an area. It has multiple dimensions in itself, and the fact that if we address vulnerabilities and capacities and manage exposure, we can reduce risk, and in that process also build resilience. But what is resilience? So I'll go to the next slide with that and take you through the definition that that UNISDR has proposed, that resilience is the ability of a system, community, or society to resist, absorb, accommodate to, and recover from multiple hazards. Meanwhile, Joe De Silva also has outlined various characteristics of a resilient location or a city, which are as follows, and I will at the same time list down alongside that what each of these characteristics are alluding to, whether they are alluding to vulnerability management or capacity improvements, or is it exposure management, and vice versa. So so the list is is similar to what Eduardo and Monica have also presented in the past. So I'll just read through this list in a way. So she talks about a resilient city to have minimal human vulnerability, to have diverse livelihoods and employment, to have adequate safeguards to human life and health, to have collective identity and mutual support, to have social stability and security, to have availability of financial resources and contingency of funds, reduced physical exposure and vulnerability, continuity of critical services, reliable communication and mobility, effective leadership and management, empowered stakeholders, and last but not the least, integrated development planning. So if we consider risk and resilience together, it is probably not entirely wrong to say that resilience is inverse of risk. So if risk is reduced by decreasing vulnerabilities, by improving capacities, or by managing exposure, we can actually improve resilience. Next, please. So now I would take you through this process of how we worked around a similar sort of index to create sort of a measuring tool for this sort of resilience mapping, measuring for different locations. We did this for the Sustainable Development Goals, the Urban Sustainable Development Goal, and within which we have a Sustainable Cities Initiative. And the idea to develop this was to have a comparative index across different cities, which collect different kinds of information, different kinds of data at various levels. Some information is collected at the national level, some is collected at the international level, some is collected more at the local level, and how all of that could be integrated for a more and better managed system of resilience. So, so assume that we have a 4-quadrant system where each quadrant represents social, ecological, economic, and political, systems of indicators. For each of these, of course, these are just indicative set of indicators here, and right now the work, of course, is still in progress. But for instance, we have food stocks or infant mortality rate for social indicators, average rainfall index, meteorological data, and other such indicators which are easily available for ecological information. Agricultural commodity prices and other commodity prices, for instance, as economic indicators other than, of course, GDP or workforce participation rate, or even the gender ratio in workforce participation could also be part of economic or social indicators. For political indicators, there are some interesting ones that World Bank and some other agencies have been using to measure. So there's governance index, there's political instability index, there are also accountability indices across different areas. So the idea here is, can we press click, please? So the idea here is that as we move from inside to outside, the resilience is increasing. So the indicators are all adjusted for the greater the better context. Can we sort of move next, please? Yeah. Next slide, please. Yes. So this. So we originally called it the Global Resilience Operating Window, but the idea with this is that can we just press previous for once? No, the next slide. Next. Yes, just stay here. So the idea with this is that we could use this sort of a visual metric to do comparative analysis between different regions, different countries, different subnational regions, cities, as long as the regions are of similar nature. We could, so if we see the two graphs below here, we are comparing a country A, hypothetical country A, and a hypothetical country B, with these different indicators which are standardized and collected at national level for different countries, and we can clearly see that the country A is probably more resilient and than country B. But at the same time, what this does give us is it gives us a sense of what are the elements that are more vulnerable in each of these two locations, and where are the capacities. So, for instance, even though country B looks like it is very deficient in most of the indicators, but it does have a soil health index and it has an average rainfall index which is fairly high. So it could be that using these indicators and the strength of this, they could actually develop their agriculture or agroforestry or other such systems to build an overall resilience in country B. What this tool could also do, next please. Yes, previous slide. Yes. So what this tool can also do is that for the same region can also try and analyze the historical trends of how things have changed. So if we see here closely, that we see that the lower quarter of this country has actually, which is the GDP per capita, GDP, and even average rainfall, seems like that quadrant is overall doing better in the last 5-6 years, whereas it is still deficient in its market food prices. So that's something that can be focused and addressed for this specific country or specific region or a city for its future development. This tool can in a way also be used for planning and coordination, and develop response strategies which are more focused and specific to this to these regions. So if you go to the next slide, for instance, this is just a suggestion that, for instance, Food and Agricultural Organization, or WFP, which is World Food Program, or World Bank Group, or be it OECD, be it these different organizations that collect different kinds of data already on ground. All of that can be collected along with the data that the national and local governments have provided, which is often of a different character as compared when they're compared across cities. All of that can be put together in one dashboard and be used for historical analysis, and like I said, comparative analysis and overall coordination between these different agencies to not just collect the data but also respond to certain issues which are important in the short, in the medium, or in the long term. So with that, I think I'll close the presentation, and I'm happy to take questions after this. Thanks.
Unmuted. Thank you very much, Garima. I think, given the time, we'd like to open up the situation, our webinar, to questions from the audience. So I'm going to turn this over to Joanna Crisp to moderate that, and please send in your questions.
Thank you, Jeannie. And thanks to all the presenters. I just want to encourage everyone to put any questions they might have into the, and Jeannie, thank you. There's some feedback from, I think, Jeannie's speakers. So we don't have any questions from the audience currently, but if any of you on the line would like to ask a question of any of the presenters, or more generally, please go ahead and type that into the questions function. In the meantime, Jeannie, do you have any sort of discussion topics or questions that you'd like to ask?
Absolutely. Unmuted. Absolutely. I noticed all of you have a framework and have selected particular indicators that will represent what is considered among your constituencies to be the important items to be measured. So I'm wondering if each one of you could summarize what that is, Monica, Eduardo, and Garima, because there's some difference across your various presentations.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Well, I think that in the case of the OECD on measuring the well-being of regions and cities, the idea that the consensus was mainly on having both material conditions, considering, the economic viability of regions and cities, and quality of life indicators. And as I said, the interactions among these two components. So how cities can be attractive, can produce jobs, and be sure that this economic growth is beneficial to all its citizens, and it's sustainable over time, environmental sustainable, but also that increase the social mobility of people, and so on and so far. One aspect that we have only briefly touched upon, but I think that it wasn't so clear just because, mainly because of data constraints, is the question of how we measure, and I think it's important when we talk about resilience, how we measure the impact of the governance and the institutional assets and the capacity of governments, local governments, and the citizenship into improving the well-being of people. When we talk about territorial resilience, we do talk about not only the recovery capacity, but also the adaptability capacity. So the capacity to learn, the capacity to reform and to become better, let's say, to future economic or natural or shocks. So on that part, while it is very clear that it's an important dimension to measure, actually the fact that you don't see it in the framework is more due to a question of how to measure it and what are the available data indicators, or how to build this information. Thanks.
Yes,
Eduardo.
Jean,
Yeah.
thank you. Let me comment on your question, which is a very interesting one. When we look at how to measure, our initial thinking was how we can capture, how we can measure how sustainable and prosperous cities are becoming. We talk about sustainability and prosperity, but how do we know when one city is moving in the prosperity path faster than other, and how to capture these dimensions? We analyze all existing indexes, or those that we came to know, and we realized that most of the indexes and measurement tools were at the national level. So we need to do an effort to translate this to city level. And this is a very important thing, because later on it was not UN Habitat to decide which are the, first of all, the dimensions that capture prosperity and sustainability. We undertook a survey in 54 cities in different parts of the world, a costly survey, in which we asked people in these cities to tell us, among a list of 17 factors of dimension of prosperity, to list the 5 more important ones. And the responses were extremely surprising to us, because with different levels of intensity in the response, people from Arab cities, from African cities, from Latin American cities, they told us the same thing. 5 factors that are the most important elements of prosperity. And those are the ones that we use in our prosperity index. Later on, we also ask the cities to tell us which, for each one of these dimensions, which indicators we could use and how. And here, using what you mentioned about the smartness of the indicators, that's the way we draw the prosperity index, which was, I would say, a global participatory mechanism and a lot of work with the experts to make sure that those indicators that were selected could be really measured. Last comment on the question of Monica. In the City Prosperity Index, we have one dimension that is governance. And here we are really innovating in the measurement tools, because as part of governance, we are using something that we call the governance of urbanization. We are measuring how capable are cities to control urbanization through 2 or different indicators. And this kind of measurement is really helpful to understand whether cities are in a position and in condition to address resilience in its different dimensions. This connection, governance and resilience, become very strong with empirical data. Thank you.
Unmuted. Yes, so that's a very good question. That's a very good question, Eugine.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think so to just do this whole process or to arrive at a set of indicators was quite a long process. So we sat across these select cities, and experts from different cities came together, and we tried to identify indicators that are collected at city level for these 4 dimensions. And it was interesting that that even though some of these indicators are, for instance, air quality, are collected across most of them, but the data that is being collected, it's very different. And similarly, there are other indices like biodiversity index, for instance, is very well developed in places like Durban, but do not exist at all in other places like Bangalore. So, this set that I presented, of course, was more was a really early version where we started out with a whole list of more than 150 indicators, which are already being collected at the national level and have urban dimension to them. And we selected a few for testing, and then we further sort of clean them out with the whole process and the negotiations of the SDG and the new indicators that have come in. So since those indicators are yet to be finalized, I have not listed them in the presentation, but it's a very different set than what you saw here. So I would say it's not just the use of certain indicator, but also the practicality of it and the availability of it. That's also important at some level.
Unmuted. So we obviously are driven by the availability of data. We also have a wonderful question from the audience, which is this: what are the practical problems between or roadblocks while implementing resilient strategies when you've got multiple stakeholders? In other words, how do you address the concerns of multiple stakeholders in your selection of indicators and your application of your strategies?
Shall I start? So,
yes.
I think, well, it's of course, there is of course a consultation process which is very important, and we haven't discussed it, but it's right, not only the multiple stakeholders that Garima mentioned is not only in terms of data collection, but also in terms of choices of the different dimensions that matters to a certain community, to a certain city. So we have a sort of two hats, if you want. On one side, as an international organization, we do have a form of consultation to reach an agreement on the framework, on the different dimensions. This is together with the governments of the OECD countries, together with the statistical officers and other parties. However, in the work we have done, we have very much insisted on the fact that for these frameworks and for these metrics to be useful, they have to be adapted to the local needs. And therefore, the metrics that we suggest and the actual indicators can be then taken and changed by the different regions and cities according to their needs, according to their aspirations. So the metrics, as always, when you have a matrix that it's valid for many countries, or for many regions, is really more like a benchmark or something to look at. But then it's very important that these metrics are adapted to the different needs and the different capacities and different interests of the regions and the cities. And we have observed that this is in place in many places, and the successful ones are those where, in fact, you do have a very broad stakeholder engagement since the definition of the objectives to be reached.
Unmuted. Thank you, Monica. We had a quick last question, which is, how do you distinguish between resilience and adaptation? Garima, do you want to touch on that one?
Yeah, sure. So resilience is some. Yes, can you hear me? Yes. So I would say that resilience is a larger umbrella, and adaptation is just it's sort of one part of it. So resilience is not just at the end of the process, but it also involves planning and reducing the risk at source in some ways, which is more of an idea of mitigation, whereas adaptation is important. It is useful for building resilience, especially when we talk about community level processes where larger policies sometimes don't end up trickling down. So that's when adaptation certainly comes into action, but just that alone is not sufficient for building resilience.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you, Garima, and thank you very much to all of our panelists. I'm afraid we're going to have to close here. We're just a few minutes after 11 a.m. New York time, but it's been a really brilliant conversation, and we will certainly not only post this webinar so that many others can have the benefit of everything that was shared this morning, but continue these discussions through our programming, through future webinars and other convenings and discussions through the Municipal Art Society and all of our partners. So again, a huge thanks to Jeannie, our fantastic board chair and leader, and all of the participants today. Just a quick plug, if I can get there, for our next webinar in the series. Mary Rowe will be participating in a webinar with our partners at Cities of Migration on the 17th of February. So please keep an eye out for this. Here's a little more info on your screen, and join us again and stay tuned for more offerings. Also, thank you everyone for your patience, as this is the first webinar with this particular team and of the year, but definitely stay tuned for many more. And if you have any ideas of topics or people that you think would make great participants, and also any work that you're doing that you're excited about sharing, please let us know. Jeannie, do you want to say any final words?
I just want to give a big hand to our speakers who tackled a very, very complicated topic very efficiently and brilliantly. And I wanted to note their communication skills, not only verbally but visually, are really terrific. So I hope all of our audience will take a look at their various websites and plunge into this topic more deeply, because it's really important. Remember, we can't manage what we can't measure. We need to measure. So thank you very much.
Lawrence, I think we can go ahead and
Lawrence, I think we can go ahead and end.